What options do you have when you owe taxes to the IRS? Find out next on Practical Law. Stay tuned. Welcome to Practical Law. I'm your host, divorce and family law attorney Henry Gornbein. I'm also pleased to say that Practical Law is the official show of the Oakland County Bar Association. Today on Practical Law, we are going to be discussing issues involving the IRS and taxes with my guest, Stephen Weisberg. Stephen, welcome to Practical Law.
Thank you, Henry. I appreciate it.
First of all, why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about who you are and your background?
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for having me on the show. I watch every single episode. I'm a big fan, and I'm a little bit nervous because this is a big-time show and a big-time lawyer in front of me, and so I am excited right now to be on here, and I hope the audience who watches this finds a little bit of entertainment from this.
Okay. We'll try and be entertaining
Yes.
on a topic that's near and dear to everyone,
Yes.
which is how to avoid paying taxes.
Right.
First of all, tell us about your background.
Well, my background is actually in corporate bankruptcy. I worked for about 5 years in corporate bankruptcy. We were doing reorganizations or really trying to get companies that needed a bankruptcy to go through in order to move on to the next stage. They weren't able to pay their debts, and ultimately someone maybe bought the good assets and that company closed, but there was a new company that came out. And my background is with companies in distress. I had some clients that were upwards of $900 million in revenue. Apparently that wasn't enough money for them to operate. But it's in corporate bankruptcy, it's in debt and distressed background, and ultimately I decided that I wanted to do something else because I kind of felt like I was working for the attorneys almost. I felt like everyone was making a lot of money, but the creditors weren't making that much money. So ultimately, that's how I decided to go off on my own, and I decided to get into something that was more personal.
And now you're doing, it's not bankruptcy, but you're helping people who have problems paying debts, especially when it comes to taxes. So
Right.
Tell us a little bit about what you're doing now.
Well, now I represent tax debtors, really just taxpayers who owe money to the IRS, whether it be an audit or just that they have outstanding amounts that they owe based on what they've made in some previous year. And a lot of people are very afraid of the IRS, which, to be honest, they should be, because they have a lot of power and kind of unfettered power where they can kind of do what they want. And so I represent those people to help them negotiate settlements with the IRS.
What are typical amounts that people owe who come to you? Is there a range that you're dealing with?
To be honest, there isn't a range. I have people coming to me, just the other day we helped a woman with $4,000 worth of debt, but I've had people with upwards of $200,000 worth of debt. So obviously that's a pretty big range. I can't really give you a set range, but we help all people, whether it's closer to 10,000 or whether it's closer to 300,000. We take them all on.
Stephen, why don't you give our viewers an overview of the IRS?
Well, I guess my overview would be they're underfunded, they are understaffed, and they don't have the resources that they need. So basically, it's a huge problem. The IRS is obviously, as most people probably know, that they're there to collect money from taxpayers who aren't paying their taxes, or maybe audit a taxpayer's tax return if they believe that they didn't identify something. But it's a big organization. They have a couple different units that are used. One is being the revenue officers who usually take on the business cases and take on the higher amount cases. And they ultimately have also a collections unit where it's just a general collections unit that the IRS uses to try to bring in money from the taxpayers that owe that to them.
What are our rights as taxpayers?
Well, I mean, I think one thing that's really important here is that, people think that I'm gonna call, they may think I'm gonna call the IRS, say I owe $15,000, just making up a number.
Okay.
I'm gonna call the IRS, they're gonna tell me what my options are, and I am just gonna accept that and move forward because they're gonna give me a fair deal and they know how much I owe and they know what the criteria is. But at the end of the day, that's not how it works. I mean, the IRS representatives who take these cases are trained to bring in as much money as possible. The IRS is not, these representatives, these revenue officers are not going to tell the taxpayer what their rights are and what they can do. But you have a right to a professional. You have a right to be heard, almost like a due process, and you have certain rights with regards to notices before the IRS can take money from you through a garnish of your wages or levy your bank account or seize an asset. There's a certain protocol that has to happen before they can do that.
Let's say someone calls you and owes, let's pick a number, $50,000 in taxes. How does a typical phone conversation go when you are, being interviewed and interviewing someone as to whether or not you're going to take their case?
So, my discussion with the taxpayer who is looking to maybe hire somebody like myself really surrounds their financials, including their income, their expenses, and their assets. As well as, of course, the overall general situation or circumstances under which they're owing the money to the IRS. A lot of people think if I owe $200,000 to the IRS, then I'm not going to be able to get a good deal with the IRS in terms of negotiation. The amount that the IRS that you owe to the IRS is really irrelevant. It's based on your personal financials, like I said, income, expenses, assets. And then obviously as an attorney who deals with this on a daily basis, there's other tricks of the trade that I'm aware of. And there's certain IRS guidelines that they're supposed to follow with regard to negotiations. Now, whether they follow them always when there's not a professional involved is another story. But you need a professional in that situation. But the discussion is about finances. It's not about how much you owe. That's almost irrelevant to some extent when the discussion happens.
Let's say someone calls you and they say, well, I'm not going to pay. What can the IRS do to them?
I'm not going to pay the IRS? Is that what you're saying? Well, I mean, the IRS has very, very strong power, unfortunately. This is not something where they're not even subject to the normal guidelines or laws that other creditors would be obliged to follow. Once you owe money to the IRS, it's put on the books right away without any sort of judgment from a judge or anything like that. And ultimately, the IRS wants to get as much money from you as possible. So they're very strong. They're basically the most powerful agency in the world in terms of collecting debt, and they have a lot of power to seize things from you. Wage garnishments is a big thing that they use, where they garnish the wages that you make. A bank levy is another big collection effort that they use, where they'll take all the money out of your bank account, up to the amount that you owe to the IRS. They can seize personal property, and they will put a lien on your home. These days, the IRS is not, for the most part, taking homes from people because they were kind of getting a bad rap for taking homes from people who maybe only owed $10,000. So they're not really taking people's homes, but they will put a lien on that home. So when you sell it, the IRS is put in a position where they can, take in any of the equity from the home.
Or if you refinance.
Exactly, same exact thing.
Exactly. Yeah. Typically, how long does a case take from start to finish? Let's say someone, going back to the same example, someone owes $50,000 to the IRS. Mm-hmm. They've decided to retain you. What are the steps that you take?
So the time frame can be very different based on the circumstances. One, we haven't really gone through some of the resolution options yet, but in certain cases, it could be a couple weeks. In other cases, it could be 9 months. So maybe when we talk a little bit more about the resolution options, I can explain, what resolution options take longer, which take, a shorter period, but it literally could be from a couple of weeks to 9-10 months.
So you talked about some of the collection process, i.e. they can levy on wages, they can garnish your bank accounts, they can file a lien on your house, they can take your personal property. They have to give notice. So when you step in, you're calling, or you're doing it in writing, basically? How does it work?
So if I have a client come in that ultimately hired me, I call the IRS and find out what exactly is going on with their case. And I speak to someone in the collections unit if there's not a revenue officer involved. I speak to someone in the collections unit, find out how much they owe, for what years, if there's any outstanding returns that need to be filed, if there's any substitute returns that were filed by the IRS on behalf of the client. And we take that information and we look at it and determine what are the next steps. So for instance, you're talking about notices. The IRS has a certain protocol with regards to notices. So once you owe money to the IRS, they assess the amount the balance that you owe, but then there's a 3 notice sequence at least that they have to send out to the taxpayer before they can take these collection activities. So if you're only at the second notice, I can then come back to the client and say, listen, you're only at the second notice from the IRS, and so we want to get this resolved, but don't worry, nothing's going to happen right now in terms of taking money out of your bank account or taking money from your paycheck, because you're only in the second notice of the 3 notice sequence.
And how far apart are the 3 notices typically?
They're 30 days.
So first thing is 30 days, and then 30 days later, and 30 days later.
Right.
Is it better for someone to bring you into the process earlier than later?
Well, number one, it's better to bring someone like me in the process earlier, if for nothing else than to try to come up with a resolution for the amount that's owed, so that the IRS doesn't put this lien on all of the taxpayers' property. The main thing is usually the home. So if you can get a hold of this beforehand, they're not necessarily going to put a lien on your home. If you wait, they're going to put a lien on your home no matter what.
And it's much harder to deal with something before a lien is put on than after.
Right, and people, of course, don't want liens on their homes. I mean, credit, you got credit issues, you have issues if you want to sell the home, you have issues if you want to refinance the home, and it's obviously a lien just isn't something that people want to have on their property. And once it's already on there, it's much harder to get it off.
Now you're making calls on behalf of many, many people. Do you deal with the same agents or collection people, or is it just such a vast pool that it's pretty random?
So if I'm dealing with a revenue officer in a certain city, like let's just obviously take Michigan and Detroit Metro. Okay. Yes, I'm dealing with the same revenue officers, each and every time that I'm talking about a client that is located in Metro Detroit. As I kind of alluded to before, the revenue officers really take on the business debts and the higher amounts that that taxpayers may owe. For smaller amounts, it goes through a collections unit, and if it's a collections unit, I'm speaking to someone different every single time. You have to call the IRS, talk to that collections unit, wait on hold for 2 hours, and talk to someone each and every time. Could be a very different person. The person before may not have taken great notes. The person after may not take great notes. The person who's talking to you may not understand the notes from before. It's a very difficult process to try to get a reasonable resolution when you're in this collections.
So it's a bureaucratic nightmare you're dealing with.
Exactly.
As you said, they're understaffed, so it makes it more difficult to reach someone.
Right.
Do you have to have a power of attorney to speak to someone, or how does that work? Because they're not
Yes.
going to just talk to anyone.
Right. Well, obviously, if you're the taxpayer, they'll talk to you. If you are the attorney who's representing the taxpayer, you have to have a power of attorney on file, and that's only related to certain years that are owed to the IRS. There's also another form that the IRS provides, which is called the Form 8821, which does allow someone who you've allowed to talk to the IRS on your behalf, and they can just download your transcripts, see what exactly you owe, what the penalties are, et cetera, but they can't do any negotiation on your behalf, and they can't do anything that would put you in a situation where you would not have agreed to it. But as an attorney, you need a 2848 on file, which is the power of attorney, so you can speak to the IRS on the taxpayer's behalf and make sure that you're representing their rights.
Now, to do what you're doing, you do not have to be an attorney. Does it make any
Correct.
difference if you're an attorney?
Right, so you can be an attorney, you can be a CPA, or you can be what's called an enrolled agent, which is the enrolled agent designation is something that the IRS provides. You take a test. If you pass that test, you become an enrolled agent. You can deal with the IRS. Now, I may be biased here, but as an attorney, listen, CPAs, they're very good at tax prep, right? And I think a lot of them would tell you that. And I've come into contact with a lot of CPAs that say, I want to prepare taxes, but I don't want to deal with the IRS. Attorneys have a different mindset. They have a different way of going about things. They know how to negotiate. They've been trained to negotiate. They know the administrative laws, and they have a much better feel for how to get you the best, and most favorable outcome possible. Whereas a CPA or an EA, they just don't have it what an attorney has.
So being an attorney and your background and training definitely makes a difference and probably makes you more effective than others.
Oh, 100%. There's no doubt about it.
What about the statute of limitations for taxes?
So, and this is something not everyone knows about, but there is a statute of limitations. It's a 10-year statute of limitations. So if the IRS assesses a balance against the taxpayer, let's say in 2010, the taxpayer files a return, and that in April of 2011, the IRS looks at it, they assess the balance in, let's say, June 2011. There's a 10-year period from June 2011 until June 2021 where they can collect from the taxpayer. If they don't collect from the taxpayer during that time period, the amount that was owed by the taxpayer is wiped away completely.
Let's say the taxpayer 5 years in makes a payment. Does that trigger the statute of limitations for another 10 years, or?
No, not at all. The IRS is happy to take your money whenever they can, but no, you can make a payment 5 years in, and has nothing to do with the statute of limitations. There are certain events that make that statute of limitations, they kind of toll the statute of limitations, like if you file for bankruptcy or if you file for an offer in compromise. But for all intents and purposes, it's a 10-year statute of limitations.
Let's say someone calls you and the person has failed to file a tax return and owes money. What happens in that situation?
Well, if someone called me and said, I haven't filed a tax return, and I'm assuming, are you saying after the deadline? Is that how you're asking the question?
Yeah.
Okay. So they say, I haven't filed the return, I owe money, I know I owe money, but I can't pay it, so that's why I don't want to file the return. That's not the way to go about it. You want to file the return because there's penalties that the IRS puts on your account based on failure to file and failure to pay. Failure to file is a big deal, and the penalties are big. So you want to file your return, and if you can't afford what is owed on that return, you then need to hire a professional, or however you want to deal with that outstanding amount. But never, my point is, do not ever not file a return just because you feel like you can't pay it, because that's, in the end of the day, that's going to be much worse off for you. You're going to have much more penalties. You're going to have to pay off much more than you would have otherwise.
So even if you owe, your advice is keep current on filing.
Exactly. You always want to be compliant with the IRS.
What if a client is currently not collectible? What happens in that situation?
So that's one of the resolution options, and there's a few different resolution options. And currently non-collectible is one that's a temporary resolution. It's where the IRS will not come and collect from you, enforced collection, meaning a levy on your bank account or a garnishment on your wages. They won't do that because they've identified that you do not have the income to pay them anything to bring your balance down. But they do that for every single year. Let's say they agree. This is what a professional, an attorney, would do for you, is to negotiate that currently non-collectible status. But a year later, the IRS is then going to look at that currently non-collectible status and say, is there now, even though they didn't have an opportunity to pay us anything to bring down their balance, are they making more money now? Has something changed? Do they now have the ability to pay us? And so a lot of times you will be kicked out of that currently non-collectible status, and then the process starts over again. But it is a very good way to keep the IRS at bay for a period of time.
What about bankruptcy? Does that have any impact on back taxes?
It does. I mean, you only have a certain amount of debts that you can discharge through bankruptcy, and bankruptcy isn't a bad thing to file if necessary, if you have a bunch of different debts that are out there. But if you have just an IRS debt, most of the time there's no real reason to file for bankruptcy because there are opportunities within the system to come up with a resolution and negotiate a good deal for you.
Stephen, how do installment agreements work?
So an installment agreement, the explanation of it is pretty simple. It's a monthly payment plan to the IRS, but there's multiple different types of installment agreements. One of the installment agreements is a partial pay installment agreement, where we identify how much quote unquote disposable income the taxpayer has, and then take that number and say, listen, we can, for example.
Let's go back to the $50,000
go
that's
ahead.
owed.
Okay, so $50,000. So let's say we do the investigation to the finances of the taxpayer, and they can only afford to pay $25 a month. But they can afford to pay something, but it's $25 a month. And they owe $50,000. I haven't done the math in my head right now.
Be a long time.
But after 10 years, if you pay $25 every single month, you're never going to hit $50,000. So in effect, you've created a situation where you've made a settlement with the IRS. So whatever you paid over that 10 years wipes out that $50,000. So if it's again, I haven't done the calculations, but if it's $20,000 that you've paid over 10 years, and you owe $50,000 and 10 years ends, then that $50,000 is gone. You've saved $30,000.
Now, during this time period, are they compounding interest on the debt, or?
Yeah, there is interest and there are penalties. And the interest isn't so terrible, but the penalties are very high. And within 2 years, you could almost double the amount that you owe to the IRS just based on penalties.
So you've got a toolbox with several options. We've talked about the offer and compromise where there can be a payment plan. What are some other offers that you do and some other results that you've achieved?
So there are a few things you can do. Currently non-collectible, which we spoke about, is more temporary, but that's something you can do. Get yourself into a protected status so the IRS can't come after you. An installment agreement, there's certain instances where you want to use an installment agreement, even if you're making a lot of money and based on IRS standards, your disposable income is very high. If you're under $50,000, you can get into what's called a streamlined installment agreement that can be negotiated by an attorney, and that means that you're paying the amount that you owe over 72 months. So that's a good opportunity for you to, if you're making a lot of money, to only pay off the amount that you owe over 72 months. Whereas if the IRS really looked at your finances, you might have to pay much more than that on a monthly basis because they're looking at disposable income. Again, I mentioned the partial pay installment agreement.
Right.
But the final one is, which people hear about on TV all the time, which is, kind of sticks in my craw a little bit because these companies like to pretend that they can do things when they can't do it. You hear, I can resolve your case for 10 cents on the dollar. they have no idea what they can do, and they're on the radio and presenting these ideas that they can resolve your case in 10 cents on the dollar, 5 cents on the dollar. But if you don't know anything about the case or the financials, you're not going to be able to make a determination whether you can do that. But the offer in compromise is something that is possible, potentially, for some people, and that's where you make a lump sum offer to the IRS. And it's formulaic, and it's based on finances, it's based on assets, it's based on the attorney's know-how, and you can ultimately settle, again, $50,000 debt for something less.
How do you reduce penalties? Because, as you're saying, they're compounding interest and penalties.
Right.
What do you do when you're negotiating? How do you reduce them?
Right. So penalty abatement is based on, first of all, there's one penalty abatement, which is what I call kind of a first-time offender abatement, whereas if you haven't had any issues 3 years prior, let's say in 2015 you owed some money to the IRS and you filed late. If you haven't had any problems with the IRS 3 years before, and you owe penalties on that 2015 return because let's say you filed late, that can be abated because you're a first-time offender. But there's also reasonable cause to reduce penalties, and that's something where if there was a death in the family or a death in someone in the organization who used to keep the books, or you had an account that gave you bad information and told you to do something, and you want to do it because you thought they were a professional, but they were wrong. So there are reasonable cause penalty abatements where you can, petition the IRS and say, look, this is what happened. This is why the IRS the tax return was late or the payment was late, and it's because of this, and this, and the IRS will remove those penalties based on specific abatements that are available.
So every case is different, and we're down to 1 minute. What are some final thoughts you'd like to share with our viewers? I wish we had more time.
Yeah.
But what would you like to share with our viewers before we sign off?
I would share to you that I don't want you to hire me as a viewer. You need to hire a professional to deal with this. You can, of course, I'd love for you to hire me, but hire somebody that knows what they're doing, because if you come to the table without having any knowledge of the process, you're kind of playing poker without knowing the rules of poker, and you are not going to end up with a great result. So I would encourage you to hire a professional. I would encourage you to hire an attorney to help you with this IRS issue, because at the end of the day, you're going to be much better off financially.
Every case is different. Stephen Weisberg, we're out of time. I want to thank you for being my guest on Practical Law. I want to thank you for watching Practical Law.